How do you tell a story that is beyond description? One that begins with man at his very worst, only to see a select few rise up and show him at his very best, whose dignity and honor never dimmed in the face of prejudice, whose stature is irrelevant due to enormous courage, whose impossible accomplishments are celebrated in far reaches of the world, yet most in their own country have no idea who they are. This is the story of the Nisei soldier of World War II, a true American hero.
And today, at long last, we award the Congressional Gold Medal to a group of Americans who are as deserving of it as any I have ever known.
The Congressional Gold Medal is Congress's highest honor, given only to those who achieved greatness for the betterment of this country. On November 2nd, 2011, a group of Japanese Americans received theirs, 70 years after their amazing story began. Nisei, a Japanese term that means second generation. If you are Nisei, that means you were born in the U.S. to parents who immigrated from Japan. You are American. But during World War II, that didn't matter. After Pearl Harbor, people of Japanese descent in the U.S. were labeled enemy aliens and forced into internment camps. Most lost everything.
It's like somebody taking a knife and cutting your heart out. You fight for the rest of your life trying to get it back.
But out of that unfairness came something remarkable.
We came out from behind barbed wire fences to prove to the United States government that we were Americans.
Many young men in the camps wanted to prove their loyalty to the United States. Eventually, they were given the chance. The Army created a segregated unit that combined the men from the internment camps with men from Hawaii, all of Japanese descent. They would be known as the 100th 442nd MIS, and by the end of the war would become the most decorated unit in U.S. military history. But more importantly, they changed the world. Their impact still resonates today. Each year in this picturesque French town of Brières, there is a celebration. Every October, its citizens gather together and honor the 100th 442nd. The Japanese-American soldiers liberated them from the Nazis. The battle for Brières took several days of bloody fighting. As you can see in this historic footage, it spilled over from the hills above the town to the streets and buildings in it. The Nisei soldiers were victorious, but it cost them many lives. Residents here say they will never forget the sacrifice. So here they are, saying thank you.
C'est le 442e.
Mayor Alain Blangy says the 442 fought hard to liberate Brières. It's important to say thank you. Without the 442nd, Brières would not be free. It's not hard to imagine what this town was like in 1944. Its beauty and charm have changed very little.
We are here. Télégraphe.
The mayor shows me pictures from then.
It says telegraph in this old photo from the 442 because we are standing right now underneath that word. If you could look up here on the wall, you see it says telegraph.
It's the same throughout the town, buildings and locations that are still here. The old photos are filled with Nisei soldiers moving through town, fighting to give new life to a place that was dark and frightening under Nazi control. And just as the buildings have not changed, many of the people haven't either. They're still here and remember.
Hello, Mr. Kononika.
86-year-old Edward Kononika was a 19-year-old fighting with the French resistance. His job was to escort a small unit of the 442 through the forest and into Brières. He says he remembers he was surprised at how small the Japanese Americans were, but brave. He says their faces were fearless. They were not afraid of the Germans. Madame Huguette Deloy says she remembers the battle. She was 20 at the time and says the Nazis were fighting the Americans from her front yard. She was scared to death. 84-year-old Fernand Didier was only 17 at the time, just a kid, fighting with the French resistance. He helped the 442 with intelligence so they could launch their attack.
442, 442.
To this day, he wants to thank them for allowing him to play a hand in liberating his home. Bernard George lives in this French countryside and knows every inch of these forests. It's hard to believe this beautiful place was once killing fields. The battle raged in every direction, and there are still pieces of evidence out there.
Oui, ça c'est une tache de sang qui est d'époque.
George has devoted his life to collecting it and telling the story of the 442 through what he has found.
So he just told me that this helmet belongs to a 442 soldier that was killed in battle. You could see the damage in the helmet. The soldier hit a landmine and was basically blown up. And the reason we know this is because his friends, his neighbors found this on their farm. They were living at the farm at the time and remember when the soldier was killed.
C'est une passion qui vient depuis.
He says it's his way of showing the world the sacrifices the Nisei soldiers made here. His way of making sure they are not forgotten. After Brières, there was no rest. Within days, the 442nd would find themselves back in the forest in an epic fight that will be labeled one of the greatest battles in U.S. history. A battalion of Texans were surrounded. The Nisei had to get them out. It will forever be known as the rescue of the Lost Battalion.
This is exactly where the Lost Battalion was dug in, up and down this hillside, and these foxholes are still here. This is a pretty good sized one. They were digging in them for 5 days, so they were substantial, and you could see, if you look around, you could see the terrain that they were dealing with, the thick forest, the hillside, and they used this to protect themselves from the Nazis who had them surrounded.
Those foxholes helped the Texans fight off the Germans. It was an agonizing 5 days.
We were getting real low on food, medical supplies, and ammunition. And the first thing they did, they tried to shoot some chocolate D-bars into us. Right away, they got on the radio and come back and stopped that because we took some casualties from that hard chocolate.
At the same time, the Nisei soldiers were suffering enormous casualties. The fighting was fierce, but they broke the German lines, and this famous newsreel was taken just moments after the rescue. The Texans, forever grateful for a second chance at life.
And they saved my dad's life.
And no one understands that more than Anthony Agnoni from Redondo Beach.
This is my dad, Anthony Agnoni's Eisenhower jacket.
His father, who has since passed away, was rescued that fateful day, allowing him to come home, have children, including Anthony.
If it weren't for the 442, Dad would have never come home and had a happy life, and I wouldn't be here.
I met Anthony at a memorial for the fallen members of the 10442nd. He was carrying his father's uniform, still saying thank you to the soldiers who gave their lives so that his father could live his.
I think that every single one of them should be honored. It's long overdue.
This beautiful yet heartbreaking place sits in the foothills of the Vosges Mountains. It contains thousands of America's fallen from World War II, soldiers who will never come home. Among them, Japanese Americans who, despite prejudice and ill treatment, bravely fought for their country and for the liberation of France. Now and forever, the adopted sons of this beautiful place.
What stands out as a bright, shining light is this kindness that this person showed to him.
Sometimes it's an act of bravery that changes the world. Sometimes it's something much more subtle. Pietrasanta, Italy, a beautiful coastal community, rich in art and history, and home to Americo Bugliani. This wonderfully energetic 78-year-old lives in a stunning, historic home with Anne, an American, his wife of 50 years. As he shows me around this amazing city, he takes me back to World War II, where life here was drastically different. The Nazis had taken over this area and kicked his family out of their house. They became refugees, no money, no home, starving. For years, every day was a struggle to survive.
Desperate times, I imagine.
Desperate time.
But in the midst of all that tragedy, one April morning, 1945, something magical happened. Bugliani says the Americans had fought their way towards town, so, as a curious 12-year-old, he went to investigate, maybe even find some food.
We were hungry. We didn't have anything, and even the American coffee, the people said it's not that good, and we thought it was fantastic.
What he found was a bunch of pup tents. It was the Nisei soldiers resting before another epic battle. This picturesque Italian environment is where the 100th 442nd was camped out before they hit the Gothic line, right under these ancient olive trees, a 1,200-year-old church right over here. And the reason they were camped here is because of these hillsides. They worked as a barrier that protected the troops against German artillery. Bugliani takes me to the very spot where he met a soldier, although brief, but a meeting he would never forget. Tell me what happened.
He came around, and he saw me, and he told me,
Just as you to come over?
He told me, come here, and you understand that probably the international language.
For some reason, that soldier began to give that 12-year-old, a perfect stranger, gifts like food and candy.
He gave me a tube of Colgate toothpaste, a toothbrush. He gave me the picture, and he said, my name is Paul Sakamoto, and that's taken to my mind.
Paul Sakamoto. He never forgot that name. Why would a stranger who has been fighting through this horrendous war suddenly decide to be so generous to this child? The war would end. Bugliani would go on to live a successful life in America and Italy. Decades would go by, and then Americo decides he wants to find Sakamoto and meet him. He discovers the Nisei soldier survived the war and was living in Hawaii. The two would finally meet. Anne remembers it well.
He was just this big. And his heart was huge, and he was just so beautiful.
It was a meeting that finally answered some age-old questions.
Paul said when we met him that he had so much compassion for the children and the suffering of the children during the war.
Sakamoto also confessed that he was about to go into battle and felt that he was not going to survive. He knew that 12-year-old boy could use those items more than he. It was a stunning admission decades later. It may have been a chance meeting in this olive field that lasted only seconds, but Anne gets why it was so important.
The stories that my husband told me of what he went through during the war, it was unbelievable what they suffered. They lost everything. They were hungry. It was horrible. And this American soldier showed him kindness. And he never forgot. And it was the only moment of happiness that he had in all those war years. It was like a bright light. It was an American soldier. And so you don't forget those things.
Just outside of Munich, Germany, lies a sacred place. A reminder of how horrible man can be. Dachau, a series of death camps scattered throughout the countryside where Jews were massacred by the Nazis. Unknown to the world until the spring of 1945, when a unit of Nisei soldiers were among its liberators, the first to see it. George Oye, with the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, remembers that day.
My first experience with having been exposed to the Dachau inmates were lumps in the snow.
This is Dachau, and the night before it was liberated, a fresh coat of new snow had fallen. What Oye didn't realize as he was approaching the death camp is those lumps that he was seeing on the side of the road, they're actually the bodies of Jewish inmates.
It makes you angry.
Oye had witnessed so many atrocities in the war, but Dachau was different, haunting, scarring.
To me, the most important emotion was guilt. Guilt for mankind, for having transgressed before God.
America alerted the world that Dachau had been liberated, but for decades refused to admit Japanese Americans were among the liberators. But Oye, an avid photographer, had the photos to prove it. This one was his first recollection of seeing inmates alive.
When we had just pulled off the road, you can see our sign with an arrow, and it says 522.
And there were witnesses. Janina Kavinska also remembers that day. She was 16. She had cheated death for 6 years in the camps, but her time had run out.
I was just sitting down the steps when a Nazi came and pulled me out of there and says, come here, you know. And he was dragging me out in the field. There was a concrete wall, bodies all over, and Nazis standing with machine guns, so I knew it was the end.
So there she was, standing against a concrete wall, blindfolded, waiting for the guns to cock and fire. But that never came.
Instead of shooting us, they were running. So when they were running, they were yelling for every Nazi to get together and get out.
Just before the Germans could pull the trigger, the camp was stormed. It was the U.S. Army, more specifically the 522nd, Japanese Americans. And one of those Nisei soldiers went out to Janina and pulled her blindfold off.
I looked at a Japanese man in front of me. He was shorter than me. He had no eyes, just slits. And he had a USA uniform on. He was Japanese, so he went down in this kind of emotion, low. And he said, from my God to your God, we are your liberators.
Janina has lived her life telling the world a remarkable story of how the Nisei soldier liberated Dachau and saved her life, even while her own country would not admit it. One of the most amazing chapters yet least known of the Nisei soldier's legacy is the Military Intelligence Service, or MIS. Many Nisei, even though they were Americans, had a firm grasp of the Japanese language and culture, and that proved to be invaluable against the Japanese Empire. Thousands were sent to the Pacific Theater. It was dangerous work. They were not only fighting alongside fellow Americans, but also given the responsibility of translating captured documents, interrogating Japanese prisoners, and intercepting radio transmissions. Their success rate was astounding.
The members of MIS were in many ways America's secret weapon in the war with Japan.
Their translations of captured enemy documents helped thwart Japanese battle plans and lead to resounding Allied victories.
Because of them, General MacArthur could later say that never in military history did any army know so much about the enemy prior to an actual engagement.
MacArthur would say the MIS shortened the war and saved countless lives. However, it's undeniable there were moments of conflict and difficulty for the Nisei. Their enemy was also their family and friends.
So I say, by the way, what school did you attend to?
Takahiro Higa lived and volunteered for duty in Hawaii, but grew up in Okinawa, and that's where he found himself during the war, interrogating prisoners, and one day realizing these prisoners went to school with him.
Finally, I was positive these two guys are my classmate. I yelled at them in a Okinawa Hogen, God damn, don't you recognize your own classmate? They look at me in shock, you know. So and they start crying. Why are you crying? Well, until now, after this interrogation is over and our usefulness is over, you guys might take us over the hill and shoot them. Now, knowing that our own classmates on the other side of the fence, we figure our life will be saved. So we cry for happiness. That kind of hit me. So three of us grabbed each other's shoulder, and I don't mind tell you, we had a cry.
November 1st, 1943. Please tell the family that I am fine and not to worry too much. Bye for now, darling, and remember that I'll be thinking of you and Steve wherever we go from here. Forever, Shukichi. And that was his last letter.
How do you honor someone you never knew? And what if that someone is your father?
Dad and I actually never met each other. Dad shipped out for training when I was, not born. He was almost 27. He was in southern Italy, and he died with his company during the crossing of the Volturno River. Oh, this is a photo of Mom and Dad taken before they were married.
Everything Steve knows about his father is spread out on this table in La Palma, California. Photos, letters, newspaper articles. It's all he has, aside from the memories of a mother, widowed and heartbroken at 24.
She was, of course, devastated when she received word that Dad had died, and I don't remember many things because I was just a very, very young child, but I do remember the grief she experienced when Dad died. This is Mom's letter to Dad, well, one of the few that I have to remember her by. By the time it reached Dad's position, Dad had already died. November 2nd, 1943, Lihue, Hawaii. Dearest Shukichi, I just keep praying every day for my dear husband to come home soon. Wow, excuse me. It seems like ages since I heard from you, and hope that nothing has happened to you. I just can't seem to think straight with all the news of the boys of the 100 being killed. We all keep praying for this war to end real soon. P.S. Steve says, Daddy, please come home really soon and carry me in your arms and play with me. We want you to come home to us and be with us until death do us part. Yours forever, Kaoru. Sorry. I can almost feel her anguish. It's almost like she had a premonition too. She started telling me, you know, we have to live longer now for Dad's share of life too. And that's the attitude she had for the rest of her life. And that's what she instilled in me too.
This is Steve's first birthday picture. It is the greatest link that he has with his father.
It was mailed to my dad. He didn't actually receive it till the mail call on the night that he died. I've talked to many of his friends that were in his company, a platoon, and the first thing they look at me and they say, "You're the baby in the picture. We just want you to know we remember your dad taking your photo, putting it in his backpack before the river crossing. And he said, we want you to know that you were with your dad on the night that he died." I cling to that memory, and I believe that I was with him.
Feuer unseres massierten Angriffes schlägt mitten hinein.
"70 years ago, the world was in turmoil, in desperate need of leadership, courage, and decency. The Nisei warrior rose up and with a quiet dignity defended what was right. Through immeasurable sacrifice, they made the world a better place, and in true samurai fashion, just as quietly, faded away. Forever modest, a lesson for the ages."
What a story. Men of the MIS and the 442nd, thank you. Congress honors you today with this medal, but believe me, the honor is all ours.